Book 20.2 The Little House in the Woods by Colin Harris. The Little House in the Woods. Contents. Chapter 1 Vandals. Professor quickly opened his eyes. He'd just had a restful night's sleep and couldn't wait to get down to his study and start his first day's work. He jumped out of bed, had a bath, cleaned his teeth, had some toast and marmalade, and a cup of coffee, and strode into his study. What a shock! Professor Quickly nearly fainted. His wonderful study had been vandalized. Professor Quickly couldn't understand it. He was alone in a big house miles from anywhere. Who could have wanted to mess up his study? It couldn't have been robbers, because, as far as he could see, nothing had been taken. It was the sort of thing silly children could do, but there were no children living anywhere near Crackpuzzle House. Then, quite suddenly, he remembered his trip round the garden yesterday, when he had seen smoke drifting up from an odd little house hidden in the woods. Perhaps someone was living there, someone who was trespassing on his land. He thought that he had better go and find out. Before long, Professor Quickly was marching across the grass towards the little house in the woods. He was so angry that he didn't see the little animals popping their heads out of tunnels in the ground and holes in tree trunks as he passed. But as he got closer to the house, he did see the smoke drifting upwards once again. Somebody was living on his land. Professor Quickly did not hesitate. He strode up to the front door and rapped on it loudly. At first everything was quiet, and then he heard these words.
"Ooh, Mom! There's somebody at the door!"
There was a shuffling sound, and the door slowly creaked open. The professor could see two children peeping out from behind their mum. He was sure he had found the children who had broken into his study. Professor Quickly looked down at the children and shouted,
"Why did you do it?"
Then he looked at their mum and said,
"You should be ashamed of yourself, letting the children out in the middle of the night."
Mum looked quite frightened. "Who are you?" she asked. "What do you want? Tom, run and fetch your dad." The boy dashed past the professor and ran down the path shouting, "Dad! Dad!" as loudly as he could. 2 minutes later, a solid-looking man came back with the boy.
Good morning, Professor Quickly. I was going to call on you as soon as you had settled in. My name is Adam Hardwick, and this is my wife Polly. And these two little rascals are called Tom and Kate. Now, children, say how do you do to the professor.
But the professor did not want to be polite.
"What are you doing on my land?"
he asked. Adam Hardwick grinned and said,
I'm sorry about that. I was going to come and explain everything to you. We have lived here for years. I used to be the gardener for the last chap who lived here, and Polly is a good cook. She used to help in the house. We stopped here because we've nowhere else to live. I hope you'll let us stay. I'll work for you for nothing.
Professor Quickly didn't know what to say. He liked this big man with his twinkling eyes and his red cheeks, but he was sure that the two children had made a mess of his study.
"I'm sorry you've nowhere to live, but I'm afraid you'll have to go. You are trespassing, you know, and last night Your two children broke into my study and vandalized it.
Tom and Kate gasped in amazement.
We did
We
not!
did not! They shouted together. For a moment it looked as if Adam would explode.
My children may be rascals,
He said.
but I'm telling you that they are not vandals. If that's what you think, we'll go today. Come on, Polly, start packing.
And he took his family back into the house. Professor quickly felt rotten. But after all, they were trespassing, and those children must have broken into his study. Nobody else lived anywhere near. He went back to his house and started to clean up his study, but he couldn't stop thinking about Adam and his family. Where would they live? What would become of them? The professor worked harder than ever and tried to forget them. At last, the study was spick and span again, and everything was in its place once more. Just then, the professor looked out. Adam, Polly, Kate, and Tom were going down the long drive, pushing a wooden cart with all their things piled up on it. Chapter 2: A Terrible Mistake. The professor nearly ran after them to tell them to come back, but then he thought about the mess in his study, and he knew that the best thing was to let them go. He stood and watched them until they vanished into the evening. Then it began to rain.
Time for some tea,
He said to himself. He closed the study door and went down to the kitchen. He sat there for about an hour, but he couldn't eat anything. He kept thinking about the children. Perhaps they would have to sleep out in the open tonight. They'd get wet through and catch colds, and then who would be to blame? He knew that he was not going to eat anything. He was ashamed of himself. Very slowly he went back to his study. At least he could do some work. That would help him to forget Tom and Kate. But he got no further than the study door. Someone had been back again, and this time they'd made a proper job of his study. For once that day, the professor did the right thing. He did not even think about cleaning up the study.
I've made a terrible mistake,
He groaned.
those children could not have possibly done this. I saw them go. What an idiot I am.
And he dashed out of the house, jumped into the car, and drove off into the rain and darkness. It took him 2 hours to find Adam Hardwick and his family. When he did find them, they were sheltering under a tree at the side of the road, looking wet and miserable. The professor pulled up, jumped out of the car.
Please come back.
He begged them.
I know that the children didn't do it. I'm terribly sorry. I've made an awful mistake. Please say you'll come back.
For a moment, the professor was sure that Adam was going to tell him to go away. But Adam was a sensible man. He could see that the professor was sorry. He smiled at the professor.
Very well,
He said.
but don't you ever accuse my children of being vandals again.
I won't,
Promised the professor.
Now jump in and let's all go back.
Sometime later, the professor dropped the Hardwick family off at the little house in the woods.
I'm glad you've come back,
He said.
I'll see you all in the morning.
He drove back to Crack Puzzle House, feeling very sad. He would be late to bed tonight. He had to clean up his study first. The professor was tired out. It had been another very long day. He went into the kitchen to get a mop and bucket and some hot soapy water, and went slowly into the study. He groaned.
Ugh.
It was a horrible job, but he still had to try to clean it up. He started on the carpet. He'd been working for about an hour, and the carpet was looking a bit cleaner when a sudden sound behind him made him look up. Standing in the doorway were Adam, Polly, Kate, and Tom. They were carrying dusters, brushes, and dustpans. "We've come to help," Polly said. Soon everybody was hard at work. Chapter 3. The Professor Thinks Hard. The study was clean, the Hardwicks had gone home, and now the Professor had another puzzle to crack. Just who was responsible for the mess in the study? He sat down and thought and thought and thought. The Professor was not the sort of man to give up easily. You do not become a professor by giving up at the first little problem you meet. It is a professor's job to find answers to difficult questions, and Professor Quickly was good at his job. He knew now that someone else or something else was to blame for making a mess of his study, and he intended to find out just who or what it was. He sat at his desk all day thinking hard. He missed his dinner, he missed his tea, he missed his supper. Darkness fell, and he did not even go to bed. He just kept right on thinking. Just after midnight, he fell asleep for a short time, but as soon as he woke up, he started thinking again. His shirt was creased, his eyes were heavy, and he was tired out, but he would not give up. He would find the answer to this problem if it was the last thing he ever did. He thought so hard that his head began to hurt. Then suddenly, just as the study clock struck 10 the next morning, he found the answer. He had thought of a brilliant plan. The professor picked up the directory and opened it up. He found the number he was looking for and made a very important call. Less than an hour later, the doorbell chimed, and the professor rushed to open the front door. Standing there was a long, thin man with a wonderful smile. On top of his head was a big checked flat hat. That was odd enough, but this hat was back to front. His checked jacket looked a little too small for him, and there were patches on it. Hanging out of his top pocket was a floppy white handkerchief with 2 big red spots. Underneath his jacket was a bright yellow waistcoat with some of the buttons missing. His trousers were extremely baggy and were tucked into his striped socks, and stuck on the end of his long thin legs were size 13 boots. He had the biggest feet the professor had ever seen. But the object this odd man was carrying was the oddest thing of all. It was a moving picture camera.
How do you do? Smiled the man. I am Quinton Figg, the expert cameraman and film director. I think you sent for me.
Come in, come in.
Said the professor. I'm very pleased to see you, but isn't your camera a bit old?
It might be old, but it still does a good job, said Quinton. You just tell me what you want me to do. The professor took Quentin up to his study and explained exactly what he wanted.
This sounds like a long job,
said Quentin as he started to set up his camera.
Have you got anything to eat?
The professor made Quentin some beans on toast, which vanished down Quentin's throat in less than a minute. Then the two men settled down to wait for the unknown messmaker to come back. For the next fortnight, the professor and Quentin took it in turns to sit in the study. In that time, Quentin ate everything in the house. The professor just couldn't keep up with his appetite. He had to drive into Oxford every single day to get more food. At the end of each day, all the food had gone, and sometimes there was nothing left for supper. Quentin would eat anything, and when there was nothing left to eat, he nibbled his fingernails. The professor couldn't understand it. Quentin ate like a horse, but he was the thinnest man the professor had ever met. Chapter 4. Quentin does the job. The days passed by and Quentin ate and ate. The professor was so tired of cooking meals, he asked Polly and Adam to come and help him out. And still nothing happened in the study. Everything stayed exactly in its place, though the professor made sure that it was dusted and polished every day. He thought that Quentin would get bored, but Quentin was quite happy to sit in the study as long as he had lots of food. Then, one dark night, it happened. Adam had just taken up a plate of egg and chips, 6 eggs and a mountain of chips, when there was an odd swooshing sound. The study door swung open and something shot into the room at the speed of light.
Quick!
Shouted the professor.
It started!
Quentin dropped his supper and dived for the camera. It was all over in less than 30 seconds, but it was very frightening. 1 minute the study was quiet and tranquil, and the next it was as if a hurricane had hit it. Papers went flying across the room, display cases overturned, pens, ink, and rulers shot off the desk and went whizzing round like boomerangs, and books fell crashing to the ground. The professor just stood there, his mouth wide open. But Quentin knew he had a job to do. Things happened so fast it was impossible to see what was making the mess, but that didn't matter to Quentin. He held onto his camera and kept cranking the handle, even though he had to duck and dive as different objects flashed around him. He was a very brave man, and at the end of 30 seconds he had got everything down on film. In much less than a minute, the study was a complete shambles. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the invisible attacker left. Suddenly, there was complete quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. The professor was pale and trembling.
What happened?
He croaked.
I don't know,
Answered Quentin.
but it was very nasty while it lasted.
The professor nodded.
I've never been so frightened in all my life.
He said.
Thank goodness it was all over so quickly. I don't think I could have survived much more.
Quentin agreed. He was very badly shaken. He picked up his handkerchief and mopped his cheek, where it had been cut by a flying seashell. Then he smiled happily.
But I got it all on film,
He said.
Now all I've got to do is develop it. Then you can have a good look at it. I'll get to work right away.
So Quentin packed away all his stuff and set off home for his darkroom.
I'll send you the film as soon as it's been developed.
He told the professor.
It should only take me 2 or 3 days.
The tired professor let Quentin out by the front door. Then he climbed the steps to his study and set about cleaning it once more. The professor could hardly wait for the cameraman to send the film back to him. Then, one morning, there was a round, brown paper packet on the doormat. The professor ripped it open and took out the reel of film. Everything was ready. He loaded the film and sat back to watch the screen. Suddenly, he saw the lightning-fast blur of movement as something struck the study. It was incredible, and it was all on film. But now the clever professor slowed the film down, and there, on the screen, was the shape of a fantastic creature. The professor went pale. It was brilliant. His plan had worked. He was probably the first man in history to see this fantastic animal. Now the hard work began. The professor went through the film frame by frame, and after several days he had built up a complete set of drawings of the unknown animal. He had even thought up a name for it, the litterbug. Chapter 5, Lost Proof. At the end of a week's solid work, the professor finished the last drawing. He was very proud of himself. He was sure that he was going to find fame and fortune as the man who had tracked down the litterbug. Now he had to have some rest, as he had hardly slept for a week. He put the notebook in one of the drawers of his desk, locked it, and went up to bed. But the professor forgot all about the reel of film. It was still on top of his desk when, later that night, the litterbug came back to visit his study. It was as if the litterbug knew exactly what it was looking for. It did not dash around the study and make a mess of everything. It simply went for the film, pulled it off the reel, and ripped it to shreds. When the professor went into his study the next morning, he could see exactly what had happened. He knew he had been a fool for not locking the film away. Frantically, he tried to contact Quentin Fig to see if he had another copy of the film, but he was too late. The unlucky cameraman had gone to film man-eating tigers in India. No one knows what the film turned out like because it was eaten by the same tiger that ate Quentin. So that was that. The professor had lost the only bit of proof that the litterbug existed. The professor went to see the Hardwicks. Tom and Kate climbed up onto his lap and stroked the mouse in his pocket as he explained what had happened and how the film was gone forever.
But surely
Said Adam.
you've still got your notes and drawings. Let the other professors look at them. They're all clever. They will know that you're not making things up.
So Professor quickly took his notebook out of the desk, got into his car and drove to Oxford. But I'm afraid that the professor got a nasty shock. The other professors thought his story was absurd. They thought that Professor Quickly had gone batty. Everyone knew that there was no such thing as a litter bug. It was nasty things called children that made all the mess. In the end, the professor gave up. It was no good. Everyone thought he was making things up. They whispered things behind his back. He could not work with the other professors anymore.
You do not trust me,
He said.
I cannot work here. I will leave today, so you had better find another professor.
He ripped up his notes and drove back to Crack Puzzle House. He wondered what he was going to do now that he didn't have a job. When he got back, Adam, Polly, and the children were waiting for him. "How did it go?" asked Polly. The professor sat down.
It was horrible.
He groaned.
They all thought that I'd gone off my head. I don't have a job anymore. I don't know what to do.
Just then a little mouse peeked out of the professor's top pocket, and Kate giggled.
You love animals?
She said.
There's plenty of room here. Why don't you open a zoo?
That's a smashing plan,
said Professor Quickly.
but I'm not sure I could do that. I can't stand to see animals locked up.
Now Adam butted in. "There are good solid walls all around the grounds," he said. "Who about opening a park where animals are free to wander about?"
You've got it.
shouted the professor.
We'll be the first zoo in Britain to have all the animals wandering free. There will be no bars or barriers anywhere, and our visitors will not have to sit inside their cars. And we'll have interesting plants too. We won't have any man-eating animals, though,"
he added quickly, and he explained about what had happened to Quinton Fig. Professor Quickly couldn't wait to get started. He thought that his first job would be to collect as many different animals and plants as he could. For the first time in his life, he would travel far and wide, seeking odd and interesting and safe creatures. He was going to have fun. He got down a big atlas from a shelf in his study, shut his eyes, and stuck in a pin.
"That's it,"
He said to himself. "That's where I'm going first. I'll book my tickets first thing in the morning."